early childhood development. Each week we talk about a different stage of children development and what children need. And now, here comes your host.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Taryn, and you are listening to The Parent Thing. We welcome Marion Makepeace back this week to week 7 on the road to the inner child. Welcome back, Marion.
Good to be here again. Thanks, Taryn.
So last week we were talking about abuse and how expecting perfectionism, how being judgmental, being controlling, and the all or nothing thinking mentality are all abuse. And we also spoke about physical abuse. Can you run us through like the specifics of that real quick, especially the verbal abuse?
All right, I don't think we ever actually got to physical abuse, but we definitely got to the verbal abuse. We just touched on it, which was the scolding part, which goes along with the things that you're talking about. There is more to verbal abuse that I'll talk about later today. But normally, the verbal abuse is not something that people understand. It's the use of threatening or abusive or insulting or harassing language, insulting, ridiculing, yelling, threatening, right? The most important thing of any kind of recognized abuse is that it's illegal between adults. It's recognized as a criminal offense or a hate crime between adults.
Right.
And yet people do it to children, and the children are defenseless. And that's where the real problem is. Because remember, children do what you do. You are teaching them by the example that you set. So if you're yelling at your kid, you're teaching your child that yelling at people is okay, right? If you're threatening them, you're teaching them that's okay behavior. Is that what you want them to be doing to their friends, their younger siblings, their partners later in life, and so forth? Mm-hmm. Because what you're doing is what they are copying. You are the model. You are the example.
So last week, you gave parents a checklist on how to rather deal with a child. And that really stood out for me. So as part of today's recap, could you please run through that list as well?
With pleasure. I would point out that when kids are misbehaving, the problem isn't the child. Almost always, the problem isn't the child. So there is a checklist that if the parent goes through that checklist, they can make sure that they're doing the right thing. Right? So that checklist is probably your best thing. So start at the beginning. Is the behavior beyond the development level of the child? Do you know what your child should be capable of at that age? Do you know what they should be busy with? Do you know what they still can't yet do? Are your expectations appropriate? Next, has the child been told and shown, more important of all things, especially when they're little, shown what is expected? Because they don't understand abstract concepts. If you describe something, they don't necessarily have a picture in their head. So they need the movie, not the words. All right? Then the next question, is the parent modeling something different from what they're expecting or what they're demanding from the child? In other words, if you've got do as I tell you, not as I do, you've got a problem because a child will copy your behavior, not your words. Right? Is the parent inconsistent in their messages? In other words, is it sometimes okay to do this and sometimes not, because that confuses the child and creates a problem? Is the child getting enough positive attention? Oh my goodness, I can't stress this enough. Kids will do anything to get attention because attention is like the breath of life for a child. So if they can't get positive attention, they'd rather have negative attention than no attention. The next point is what is being expected or demanded in the best interest of the child or just what suits the parent? In other words, because I say so, or you do it like this, or whatever, isn't a good enough reason. There needs to be a valid reason that's in the child's interests why they should be doing what the parent is asking. Next, is the parent's expectation or demand coming from an unhealthy or unreasonable attitudes, like we spoke about earlier, perfectionism, judgmentalism, all-or-nothing thinking, controlling behavior, and so forth. So you do what I say regardless of what's good for you kind of thing, or this is how it is.
Yeah.
And then is the parent modeling behavior that might make the child develop disrespect for them as an authority figure? Because if parents are behaving in ways that are unhealthy consistently, the child will become disrespectful. They will lose trust in authority. And that's the whole point, the major topic for today, because losing trust in authority figures is really one of the most terrible things that can happen to a child. And authority figures, initially at least, are parents, and subsequently they are teachers. Those are the most, and primary caregivers. So anyone where the child is spending significant periods of time. So it can also be, if they're home with granny in the day, or they're with a childminder or whatever, those are also authority figures for the child. So when
Right.
I must kind of clarify that one for you, Taryn, because it's really important. We're talking the parent thing here, and I tend to refer to parents, but actually all of this, everything I've been speaking about, is relevant in terms of the primary caregivers, whoever that might be. And it's really important. In fact, I was really impressed with one lady I dealt with some years ago, because she actually took her domestic helper and asked her to go through the course with her, the parenting course that she did, so that they were all on the same page.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really intelligent thing to do.
Yeah, very important.
So all primary caregivers. So if you've got somebody who's using verbal abuse, all right, who is yelling and harassing and shouting and shaming and so forth, if that's their primary caregiver, even if it isn't the parent, it's going to create a problem for the child and create damage. Am I making sense?
Absolutely.
So you asked me earlier what verbal abuse is, and I probably should have gone into more detail. So perhaps let me do this now to be quite clear what I'm talking about. Things like excessive criticism, chronic nitpicking about, for example, how the child looks, how they think, how they act, how they dress, how they talk. So often that goes with mocking and shaming. Like, you look so stupid, you act like this, you dress like those are horrible things that people say and they don't realize, right? So you can be a little fatty. I had a father who called his daughter fat girl. She was not fat, but he called her fat girl all her life. How's my fatty? In fact, he used to send her texts addressed to PHATTY, fatty. Yeah. Invalidating emotions, telling the child that they're wrong, that it is wrong, or worse still, they are wrong to feel what they're feeling. Don't be so stupid. Don't be unhappy about that. You can't be sad about this. You may not be angry with your brother. Those are invalidating. You can acknowledge, I can see you're feeling sad or angry or whatever, but you still can't hit your brother. In other words, invalidating is a form of verbal abuse. Gaslighting the child. Gaslighting, I think people have become aware of now, but that you're being too sensitive, you're overreacting, you're taking this too seriously. Don't get upset about that, right? You're being neurotic. Negative labeling, things like, you're a naughty child. My worst, this woman that was our neighbor, she used to say, this is the naughty grandson. He's always naughty. That child was labeled. He was stuck with it.
Yeah.
Right?
And we definitely did touch on the labeling in last week and the week before, talking about how it's one thing to address a child's behavior and another thing to label them as something.
Yeah, well, it's their identity. And children don't have any other mirror for their identity than the authority figures in their world.
Yeah.
So yeah, calling people crybabies or naming them the clumsy one, and even ironically, my mother did it to me. I remember her saying to us as children, to my sister, you're the pretty one, but then she'd turn to me and say, but at least you're the clever one.
Ooh.
So I could never accept that I could be pretty, because that was my sister's. I was labeled as clever, but I wasn't labeled as pretty. So I struggle to this day to see myself as pretty. Strange. Making jokes at the child's expense. Something like, you look like a monkey, you belong in the zoo. Often followed by, just kidding. If you have to tell someone you're kidding, you're not.
Yeah. What's the saying? Many a truth are spoken in jest.
Yeah. but it's nastiness. And it's
Yep.
that critical, abusive thing that makes a child wonder and not know what to do to make it different. Obviously, things like yelling, screaming, or swearing at the child. Negative comparisons are another one. Why can't you be more like your sister? She's not messy like you. Or, why can't you be more like whatever? And you always come out looking second, right? Blaming the child for things that are out of their control. And now we spoke about this as terms of being responsible for the parent's emotions, which the child has no control over actually. But other things like, it's your fault your little brother hurt himself. You should have been watching him better. It's not a child's job to look after another child.
Absolutely.
And, this making a 4-year-old look after a 3-year-old is abuse. Actually, making a 10-year-old look after a 3-year-old is still abuse.
I agree.
And you'd be amazed how many times I see that that's what's happened. And a lot of the adults that I deal with, right, have carried that sense of responsibility for something that's happened to their sibling.
I'm one of
Right?
them.
Oh, really? Okay. Sorry, didn't know about that one. But, it's not a child's job to look after other children. It really isn't. It's the parent's job. And you can't blame the child if one of their siblings or gets hurt. It's ridiculous. Anyway, it happens. Shaming or humiliating the child in front of others. Oh, doesn't he look silly? Look at how he's buttoned his shirt. In my husband's family, they refer to it as Stephen buttoning because their one brother had some challenges. And
Oh, wow.
it's become a label and a humiliation. So the humiliation is now carried to the other siblings. So everyone in the family talks about it, and there are 5 of them, right? Oh, so he is humiliated routinely every time any one of the others did the same thing. Giving the child the silent treatment, putting them in Coventry, not speaking to them, pretending they're invisible. That is actually, ironically, although it's the opposite of verbal, it is a form of verbal abuse. Threatening severe punishment, things like, I'm going to lock you out of the house all night if you don't stop that, right? Threatening to hurt the child. I'm going to give you such a good hiding, you'll really have a reason to cry.
Yeah,
That
stop
kind of
crying or I'll give you something to cry about.
Yeah, that one. Many of my generation certainly knows it. Okay, the best way to identify if something is verbally abusive is to ask yourself, is this what I would want my child to be doing to me if they were an adult and I was old and frail and dependent on them? In other words, put yourself in the child's shoes.
Right. And parents need to bear in mind that the way they speak to kids, or adults rather, bear in mind the way you speak to children is how they in turn will speak to you and to other people, because that's what's modeled. That's all they'll know. So it's physically like it is impossible for them to know another way to speak to somebody if that's all that they've been getting.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, you are the model. And so the same thing happens, I have to tell you, about physical abuse. And again, I want to talk about it because it's so important. The world is changing. When I was a child, it was perfectly normal for teachers to hit the children in the class. And I was hit more times than I care to remember.
I caught a whiteboard duster a couple of times in my life as well, against the head, not in my hands.
Okay, well, I remember my teacher hitting my hand with a wooden ruler with a metal edge till my hands bled. And that was considered to be acceptable. Fortunately, there's been a wake up regarding this. And the truth is that first of all, there's an understanding. When an adult hits an adult, it's called abuse, it's called an assault, and it's generally considered a criminal action. However, many parents still hit children and genuinely see nothing wrong with doing so. But I want to offer you a comparative. Can you imagine your boss at work coming to you and giving you a hiding because you got a project at work wrong?
It's so funny you say this, like, you've not done my complete parent course, but this is a part of it. Like, this is what I speak about. And I break down even the spare the rod, spoil the child verse and what that actually means and how it's been misconstrued across the generations. But I give this exact example. It's funny. We clearly
Well,
think
it's
alike.
not funny, it's terrifying, because the fact
No.
is,
I'm saying how alike we think is funny.
well,
That's what
exactly
I'm saying.
that. The whole point is that biblical rod that they talk about is a shepherd's crook designed to rescue sheep. Can you picture a shepherd beating his sheep because they weren't following the path. I
So
mean, the sheep would run in the opposite direction when they saw the shepherd coming.
the reality is the shepherds back in the day had a rod and a staff. One was the hook and one was like a baseball bat type thing. But the hook was to reel sheep in gently, and the staff was to beat away intruders. That's where the beating came in.
Yes, but never
So
to
like
shoot
any
sheep.
bears or wolves or whatever that would pose a threat to the sheep, that's what got beat, not the sheep itself.
Correct. So spare the guidance and spoil the child, maybe, or spare the rod in the sense of beating off the intruders and the negative stuff, the damage to the child. That would be true. But using that as a reason to hit a child, I'm sorry, that's not guidance, because you are modeling the example you want the child to copy. So if you're giving a child a hiding, you're teaching for them that you sort problems out by hitting people. So what do you expect from them? And when you're old and frail and they're irritated with something you're doing, you've broken the china because you're clumsy with arthritis, but they beat you up? Really? So in fact, I want to point out the fact that even watching violence is traumatic to a child.
I've got like a few stories on that.
I'm sure.
I've had to do so many interventions because of children's changed behaviors because of what they're watching on TV. I've done that so many times with parents.
Well, there is a reason why films, for example, have a 2 to 16 age restriction, because the child is not old enough to understand. I mean, I could get on my soapbox about how I think watching violence is what creates circumstances where kids do things in schools and to other children that are physically violent, because violence has been normalized in cartoons and things. But anyway, that's another subject for another day. But the bottom thing for me is when a child watches violence, in other words, a parent hit another older child, for example, or worse still, hit one of the other parent, two things happen. First of all, there's the modeling. This is how we sort the problem out. We beat it. And secondly, the implied threat to the child, you might be next. So it's a double trauma in a sense.
Right. So it doesn't really instill respect in a child. It instills fear. So your child fears you versus actually respects and values what you have to say, but they do everything out of a place of fear. And I speak from a place of experience with that. Listening because you fear the consequences of if you do not listen.
Well, the whole thing is hopefully your parents are authority figures to the child in a way where the child wants to copy them, wants to learn from them, wants guidance from them, trusts them, feels safe around them, right? So, I mean, most of the Western world, at least the schooling system now, understands that violence is not the answer, that giving a child a hiding just teaches them to hate you, distrust you, and to be afraid of you, but it does not actually motivate different behavior other than, as you say, fear-based.
Yeah.
And it creates authority issues, which can be a problem. It usually starts in adolescence. And this is how you get people landing up with joining gangs and things like this, right?
But this is also why the high school system is as bad as it is, and teachers dealing with children abusing them, and teachers dealing with disrespectful children, and like I know I could never teach high school. Like I have a cousin that teaches high school, and I hear her stories, and I'm just like, yeah, I'd go to jail. This is not for me.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can help to prevent that, at least in our little corner where we're working, please God.
Right.
All right. In this day and age, I also think we can move on. I mean, I think this is reasonably obvious, but it's the subtleties that are always where we trip up. It's the softer versions that we don't realize. Hopefully I've covered enough on that. And the other thing is, in this day and age, I think overt sexual abuse is something most people recognize as a problem. But it's important to remember that sexual abuse isn't just a physical act. It's anything that involves the child in activity for sexual gratification for another. In fact, it's useful to define it because sometimes that helps the clarity. So it's forcing or enticing a child to take part in sexual activities, whether the child understands what is happening or not. And that's an
Mhm.
important thing, because often children haven't any idea till years later what they've been exposed to.
Yeah.
So it may be that they're involved with physical contact. I don't want to really even go into the details of that, but I mean, it's fairly self-evident, I think. But non-contact activities such as involving children at looking at pornography, or even in the production of pornographic material, or even watching sexual activities, or using sexual language towards a child, or encouraging children to behave in sexually inappropriate ways. That's
Mhm.
one version of the legal definition. So it's important, for example, for parents to understand, especially in this day and age where it's everywhere on the internet, how damaging it can be to be exposed to pornography, and that that is actually sexual abuse. Also, sexual language directed towards a child. And that's particularly important for pubescent children, right? Where they're becoming aware of their sexuality. And so it can be also mockery, when boys are starting to have their first physical responses, and to be mocked about it. But girls, where their bodies are developing and so forth, to suddenly be confronted with sexual commentary on their bodies, it's actually a form of sexual abuse. Because
Absolutely.
the big problem is that it's necessary to educate and guide children about sexual matters. So it's also important that it's spoken about, that it's not a taboo subject, because that is abuse in the same way that the silent treatment is verbal abuse. Failure to educate on the subject of sexuality is a form of abuse as well, because
I,
it leaves the child unprepared.
it's such a taboo subject as well, because I know that like a lot of schools do give like sexual education classes and whatever, but I believe that it should start at home. I believe that parents should be talking to. I mean, I saw a video the other day of how the mother said she doesn't just teach the child stranger danger, because the reality is that most sexual attacks come from people who are close to the family. So it's
Mm.
more an awareness of what is appropriate and what is not, even when the person is not a stranger. And that's the education that needs to be given to children today.
Correct, and very young. The basics of healthy physical and sexual boundaries should be being taught to children from when they're very young. I mean, sex education is something that should be being addressed rationally and responsibly by parents from very young.
Right. I mean, I know growing up, like we would go to family functions or whatever, and like we get there and we were forced to hug and kiss every auntie and every uncle that was in the place, even when it was uncomfortable for us. Like, even when I was like, physical touch is not a thing that I like. I don't like to be hugged, and like, unless it's people that I allow close to me. And I think that could be part of the reason, is because I was forced into it. And I feel like children should have the right to say, I don't want to hug uncle so and so, or I don't want to kiss auntie so and then not be labeled as rude, because that's what it was for us. We were labeled as rude when we didn't want to greet them the way they expected to be greeted. And I think that's important for parents also, to stand up for their children, in that if a child is not comfortable to go hugging and kissing all over the place, to let them greet with a high five or simply say hello. That's good enough, without the adult's ego taking over and being like, oh, they're rude because they didn't get what they wanted.
I would absolutely endorse that. But I think there's also, I mean, look, unfortunately, you're quite right. A lot of sexual stuff happens within the extended family. And I mean, we all know, for example, that incest, which is any sexual activity between family members, so for example, between siblings, between parent and child especially, is a criminal offense in most countries. But I mean, that also applies to
Most,
uncles.
not all,
Most, no,
most.
no, I know. I'm well aware. Fortunately, we're talking about the part of the world where it is a criminal offense. But there is something I do want to bring to people's attention, which is a much more subtle form of incest that can occur between parent and child, which is a form of emotional abuse, and which we do need to talk about, which is emotional incest.
So what is emotional incest?
Okay, so emotional incest is where the parent looks to their child for emotional or social support that would normally be provided by another adult, usually their partner. So if their marriage isn't working, or they've become a single parent, or whatever. So this might involve the parent relying on their child for comfort or company when they're feeling lonely or sad, or confiding adult concerns like their worries around work or money or marital issues or whatever to their child. And even treating them like a mini adult, looking to them for opinions and advice and sometimes even practical help on these subjects.
I've seen that before. I've had a colleague and other exposure to it as well, who was pretty much borderline obsessed with their kid, and the kid had to take on all mom's emotional baggage. And like, even if the child wanted to go out with friends, or I mean, like, obviously supervised because he was really young at the time, but I think that the relationship is still that way. He's like, she wouldn't let him sleep in a, like, even when he wanted to sleep in his own bed, she wouldn't let him because, oh, you're going to leave me to be lonely and I'm going to be so scared without you, and you need to keep me safe, and like that type of thing. And I was just like, this is not normal.
The problem is, what you're doing is you're forcing a child to take on the role of an adult when they're still a child. Apart from anything else, their brain isn't fully developed. They don't actually have the skills and they don't have the emotional maturity. So while it might initially make a child feel like they're special, this creates an unnatural kind of bonding with the parent. And effectively, it forces the child to lose childhood. It leaves the child feeling burdened with adult responsibilities. And it can create problems with relationships later in life. In fact, I was talking with a client just this very morning who's in that type of situation, and she doesn't know how to build a relationship where she isn't almost in a maternal role with her friends and her partners. She kind of goes into mummy mode because she learned to go to mummy mode with her own mother.
Mm-hmm.
There's I don't know how well known it's in the States, but there's a lovely British TV comedy series called Ab Fab, where you can see the example of the mother being childlike and the daughter having to become the grown-up in the house and take care of her mother. And it's that kind of behavior where the mother kind of hijacks the child to become her confidant, her partner, her companion. That is a form of emotional abuse. There is a milder form of this, well, or a variation perhaps on this theme, called enmeshment or codependence, which tends to be more the whole family, where we're talking about what I would describe, I guess, best as blurred boundaries. So it's very much a kind of us versus them with almost no boundaries with the us. In other words, you're an extension of me and I'm an extension of you, and there's no actual edges that keep us physically or psychologically separate.
Yeah.
So what happens then is that the child doesn't really get to identify who they are as an individual. They don't learn how to recognize, never mind meet their own individual needs. So they become a part of the us rather than an individual me. And again, it's inhibiting healthy personal development, learning what do you like as opposed to what we do as a family. You understand the distinction? I hope I'm making that clear.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were talking about it a moment ago, emotional hostage taking, where the child is made to feel responsible for parental neediness or distress. So that mother saying, oh, I'm going to be scared and lonely if you don't come and sleep in my bed, right?
Yep.
That is making the child responsible for your distress and demanding they change what they want to do to suit you, the parent. That's not okay. Again, that's emotional abuse. That's using a threat to become ill or have a crisis if the child wants to be too independent for that parent's comfort level. So what we're talking about here is that the parents' needs, whether they're emotional, physical, or social, or whatever, are prioritized and the child's needs are diminished. And again, that's not being done for the benefit of the child, which is what parenting needs to be about. So we're talking a whole range of different forms of abuse here. Bottom line, we need to recognize childhood's brief enough. Goodness me, in this day and age, it seems to me the kids are already under too much pressure from school way too early.
Mm-hmm.
Childhood's brief enough as it is. And behaviors like this from parents basically steal childhood from their children far too early, leaving the focus on the parents rather than on what's best for the child's development. I mean, there are a couple of other things we could mention when it comes to abusive environments. I think maybe we should just tick off the list.
Mhm.
There are other things that can traumatize children that are sometimes beyond the parents' control. And I want to just mention them in
Right. So
passing.
that was actually a question that I had for you. So I know that speaking about the things that parents do that influence, or I know you call it the factory settings of an adult or of a child that form or influence the inner child. And so I know that there are things that happen that's out of the parents' control, but I always say, even if you have the best of intentions, like even if you don't intend to hurt somebody, but your actions or even stuff that's out of your control does hurt, whether or not you intended to. So especially like if a parent does have like a mental illness and they are incapable of meeting the child's needs, the child still has those needs, and so it still
Correct.
affects who the child becomes. So what are
Yes.
some other things that form or are part of forming who a person believes themselves to be?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that chronic instability, which can come sometimes, for example, where people are forced to move because of their work. And so there's a lot of upheaval in the child's life. They keep moving to different locations. You get this with what's known as the military brat syndrome, where the parent is in the military and they're moved from base to base to base. And the child never can settle and put roots down, and friendships end abruptly, and so forth. And it's repeated. Also, that the parent is, one of the parents is deployed for extended periods. Those are potential problems for children. And actually, if the parents recognize it, they can provide counseling and support for the child while the process is happening. Something very important. Recognize and reassure the child that their reactions are appropriate.
Yeah, so I mean, you use military as an example, but like more common, I would say, is if parents split up and the dad has to go away for a little, like, that's more common than the military. Or there are parents who, like, financially struggle and have to keep moving from house to house in terms of affordability, and that type of thing also causes unrest and instability in the child's life. And I do feel like maybe it's more common than having a family in the military.
Well, I was thinking about the constant moving, but you're right. There are also other traumatic circumstances that can happen, like a sibling with a really severe illness, or a parent with a severe illness, right? Or, my stepdaughter was widowed when her children were young. And that's a traumatic event because
Right.
she lost her husband, they lost their father. And it had a massive impact on their financial circumstances as well. And to recognize that the child, often the parents get lost and they don't see that their children are struggling because they're so busy dealing with their own personal traumas. And so it's a really important thing to recognize that kids may then need counseling and support at that point.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to say that, in this situation, my husband's daughter has arranged for counseling for her children, and it does seem to be helping. And then there are other things like, obviously, addiction in the home, because that creates unpredictable and chaotic circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the parents is dealing with addiction issues. And as you've already mentioned, things like financial circumstances that are changing and so forth, where there is chronic chaos, all of that has a trauma impact for the child.
Yeah.
And so there are normally organizations and institutions that can help parents to support their children through these circumstances, but the parents have to recognize that the child needs support. In other words, they have to be sufficiently aware of their role and responsibility as parents to provide for the needs of their child, and to recognize that if they can't, then they need to find somebody who can do that help. When it comes to the school, there's often some support through the school where that's appropriate. So it's something else to look out for. But it's just to put it on the table as things that can create impact on those factory settings later on in life, brings people to me later on. Thanks.
Yeah, and I mean, there's parents who do the absolute best they can in their home, and they create a home that's healthy and functional and all of that. But then the kid has to go to school, or the kid has to deal with other adults out in the world. Like, there's always factors and influences that a parent can't control, but that
Correct.
shapes how a person sees themselves and what they believe about themselves to be true.
Yes,
Also
unfortunately,
traumas.
absolutely. Parents can only do the best that they can do. But the whole thing is, if they are doing the best they can, and they have this knowledge and understanding, they will presumably have created an environment where the child feels able to bring concerns and fears and distress. I think the
Yeah.
saddest thing is when children don't feel able to come to their parents for help when something isn't right, because they're going to get blamed, or they believe they're going to get blamed or shamed or whatever. In other words, that their perspective is not going to be heard. So it's really important that parents do create that safe space for their children. I guess that's really the bottom line.
Yeah.
That I'm trying to point out. It's just
Absolutely.
the home needs to be a safe place. So, we've talked about extreme stuff in this particular thing, but bottom line, what we're talking about is the what not to do. And essentially what we're trying to suggest is that parents need to be approachable and open to listening to their child, respectful of what the child is feeling and needing and experiencing, and then constructively responsive.
Yeah.
In a way, and providing an example that they would want the child to copy and repeat later on in life.
And that's where I'll plug myself, Marion, and say that parents who want to do this can come and see me and do my course and change lives.
Well, absolutely. I think the greatest gift we can give the world as parents is happy, healthy children who will grow up to be sane and healthy, rational adults, responsible and reasonable. I mean, the world needs more of that.
That it does indeed. Thank you so much, Marion. This has been so much fun. And I see that we're finally coming to the end of the series. And I think next week we can get into this inner child thing that I initially had asked you. So I'm super excited.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Taryn. It kind of feels like this has turned into a marathon when we had initially thought it would be a sprint. But I felt like in order to explain how factory settings could get laid down incorrectly or in a way that's unhealthy, it was necessary to give you this amount of information. And I hope that parents have found it useful listening to this. And so when we talk about that inner child, we are talking about the factory settings that we develop in response to what we were experiencing as children from our primary caregivers, whoever they might be, primarily parents, but obviously whoever's looking after the child when they're young, and then the early days in the schooling system. So yeah, it's really an important, as I said, I believe that parenting is probably the most responsible job any of us ever have to do, and the one for which we have the least amount of training. So I'm really happy that you're out there doing that and helping parents and providing a safe and non-judgmental place for them to also grapple with the challenges, because it is a challenging job. And I really think anyone who's listening to this is probably already, the kind of person that you want as a parent, because they're taking the time and trouble and effort to listen and try and do better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we will chat to you again next week.
Thank you so much, Taryn.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning into the parenting. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions, feedback, or content suggestions, please email us at taryn@theparenting.com. Please remember to subscribe, like, share, and give my aunt a 5-star rating. Come back again